So the Bank of Canada was the first to cut rates out of all G7 nations, first central bank to cut. And the Bank of Canada cut a quarter point, as many of you know, went from a 5% rate down to a 4.75% rate. So that is in the rearview mirror. Now the questions all turn to, will they cut again? How soon will they cut? How many cuts will the Bank of Canada have or initiate by the end of the year? And how much can they actually cut if the Federal Reserve or the US does not cut rates? These are all questions that have been floating out really since we saw the first interest rate cut. And our first chart in this area is one that we kind of never really had before, which is one of my favorite charts. And it's the first time that we were able to put the Bank of Canada interest rate cut. There you see it there. You see it towards the end or the right side of the chart, 25 basis points versus the CPI or inflation, which is 2.7%. And then at the bottom, you have GDP. And the GDP is basically growth in our country. And you can see how it's been flatlining in and around zero or just slightly above zero, between 0 and 1% now for quite some time. So what does that tell us? Well, tells us that the Fed has definitely cut rates for the first time. Tells us that CPI or inflation is definitely coming down to 2.7%, as we can see here, down from, I guess a high of 8% a few years ago. And why is this happening? Well, I think the Bank of Canada is realizing that growth has been very small. There's not been much growth at all in our country for a while now. You couple that with inflation coming down, you couple that with some of the softness we're seeing in other areas in our economy, and that leads you to believe that the Bank of Canada will continue to cut rates. The question is, how much or how quickly will they cut rates? I think even though the Bank of Canada says they do have some wiggle room with respect to how much they can cut before we see a cut in the US, if we start to see maybe 3 or 4 cuts before the Fed, we see a 1 percentage point off our rate. So we go from 5%, let's say, to 4%, which is basically where you'll see in this next chart, if we can put it up, where the predictions are by our major banks in and around 4.25% by the end of the year, by December the 11th rate announcement. You compare that to the Fed, you're probably going to see our dollar fall further. Right now, we have a dollar that is between 72 and 73 cents as compared to the US. If we were to cut 2-3 times more, where would our dollar be? It's quite possible our dollar could fall towards that 70-cent mark and perhaps breach that, maybe temporarily. And in turn, that means that whatever we're importing from the United States becomes a lot more expensive. Our exports become cheaper, which is a good thing for our manufacturing sector, but it's our imports that become a lot more expensive and perhaps become inflationary in nature, because obviously prices go up when we're using our dollar to buy their goods if our dollar were to fall. So things become a lot more expensive, and therefore possibly we could see inflation start to pick up a little bit because of our currency declining. So we'll see how far the Bank of Canada can go. Next chart we have here, this is Bank of Canada versus the ECB, European Central Bank, and also the Fed is on here as well. And you can see that both European Central Bank, Bank of Canada made their first rate cut, but the Fed has stand pat. They're not going to cut, and it doesn't look like they're about to cut anytime soon. So today's meeting at 2 p.m., the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, Jay Powell will speak. We all know they're not going to cut rates, but what will he say with respect to when the first cut will happen? We're also going to see projections by the Fed. Last time we received projections, they were projecting or predicting 3 cuts, and perhaps they will now say maybe 1 or 2 only this year, maybe 1 in September and maybe 1 in December. That seems to be where the percentages are falling right now. So we'll see what the Fed says at 2:30 when they give their press conference. So the rate cut, the rate announcement, not as important because we know there's not going to be a rate cut at 2 p.m. But more importantly, what will the Fed say come 2:30 when they have their presser, when they talk about what they believe is going to happen in the future? And I think in turn, that will affect what the Bank of Canada can do going forward.